Okay, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining us again. This is webinar 5 in our post-2020 webinar series, where we aim to keep our constituency informed on processes and engagements that are taking place and that are planned on the roadmap and timeline towards 2020, the critical moment for nature. So thank you for joining us from wherever you are. A few housekeeping before we get started, just to let you know this webinar will be recorded and any resources that are mentioned in the webinar will be sent through with the recording to all those who have registered. In terms of some questions and discussion, we are hoping to have some time for that at the end of the webinar once the presentations have taken place. And there are two ways in which you can ask questions. Firstly, by raising your hand using the little hand icon on the panel on the right, or by typing your question in the questions box. So a warm welcome to everyone and thank you again for joining us today. Today we are going to be looking at some feedback on some ICLEI processes and some engagements that ICLEI has been a part of towards the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the position of local and subnational governments therein. The overall agenda, we will start with Ingrid Coetzee, who is the Senior Manager of Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions at ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. And Ingrid will be presenting an overview of the Open-Ended Working Group meeting, the first one, that was held in Nairobi, Kenya from the 27th to the 30th of August. And she will also provide an update on the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming on which she sits. Thereafter, we will have a presentation by Kobie Brandt, who is the Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the Cities Biodiversity Centre. And Kobie will be presenting on shaping the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and ICLEI's 10-point framework for subnational biodiversity action. And thereafter, we'll have some questions and discussions. So apologies, I haven't introduced myself. My name is Timothy Blatt. And I'm a professional officer in the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ingrid.
I'm just going to go back to that previous slide. Morning or good afternoon, evening, everybody. It's Ingrid speaking. I just want to go back to the previous slide just to locate ourselves temporally in terms of where we are on the roadmap towards COP15 next year, at the end of next year. And you'll see we're already now in the center of your screen. You will see that we are at webinar 5, and this week of September, this month of September is actually quite a busy month. There's the Climate Week, which is taking place as part of the UN General Assembly meeting in New York later this month at the 75th session of the UN. There's going to be a very important meeting of the Ramsar Convention, which is also taking place towards the end of the month. And there's a range of other meetings and thematic consultations that are happening, as well as some of the partner meetings as well. And we're building up towards the SABSTA meeting in November, and then the Climate COP, which will take place in December. So, and my topic today is then just to give you a feedback on what happened last week at the Open-Ended Working Group, which was the first meeting of this Open-Ended Working Group, and also just to update you on the work of the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming biodiversity. So the Open-Ended Working Group was established at COP14 in Egypt, and specifically to develop as part of the preparatory process towards COP15 in developing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and the Open-Ended Working Group under the chairship of two co-chairs, Mr. Francis Ogwal from Uganda and Mr. Basile van Haar from Canada, was established to support the preparation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the further important task of this Open-Ended Working Group is in the run-up to COP15 in the negotiations and developing the new global biodiversity framework prior to the COP15. The co-chairs will manage that negotiation process. And that obviously is being overseen by the Bureau of the Conference of Parties. And the process, the post-2020 process, consists of a very ambitious, comprehensive program. It started off at the beginning of this year with a series of regional consultations. There's a series of thematic meetings that are in the pipeline, and some going to be held quite soon. And these cover areas such as area-based conservation, ecosystem restoration, and there's a whole range of other topics as well. There have also been other important meetings, such as the science conference at Trondheim, Biodiversity Science Conference. Then there was a meeting in Bern on the coordination amongst the conventions, the Rio conventions. The Open-Ended Working Group itself has 3 meetings. There's 2 left, one in February next year, which will be held in Kunming in China. And then the last one will be in July, just before the COP, and that will be held in Cali in Colombia. There's also the subsidiary body on scientific and technical and technological advice, which will convene twice before COP, later this year in November, and then in the middle of next year in May. And the subsidiary body on implementation, the SBI 3 meeting, which will take place also in May next year. So in terms of the first meeting, which, as Tim said, took place last week in Nairobi at the UN campus, it essentially was a meeting of parties to the convention, as well as to the protocols under the convention, and then there were also observers, and it was a big group of people that came together. The important thing about that meeting is to understand that it was not a negotiation on content or text as such. The main focus of the meeting was twofold. The one was to get clarity on the structure of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. In other words, what will be the main elements of the new framework. And the second was to get, to discuss the future work program of the Open-Ended Working Group. The agenda consisted of 3 main items. There were other items as well, but the 3 most important ones were firstly the reports of consultations that had been held up to date, as I said, the regional consultations, but also other contributions that have been made up to date to the post-2020 process. Then the bulk of the meeting discussed and addressed the issue of the structure, the potential elements and the scope of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And then the last day was spent talking about the future work program of the Open-Ended Working Group, allocating tasks to the different intersessional bodies and processes, etc. There were several outcomes coming from this meeting, and I'm not going to go into details about all of them. I'm just going to highlight some of the most important ones, particularly those that are of relevance to our local and subnational government constituency. The first was the adoption of a non-paper on the possible elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Then there was an agreement on a very, very long list of meetings and consultations and workshops that are going to be held in the run-up to COP15 as we develop the Global Biodiversity Framework. These included meetings that are being organized and convened by the CBD, as well as other UN bodies, but also meetings that are being organized by various other actors and partners, including local government networks such as ICLEI, the IUCN, various sector interest groups, the business sector, FAO, etc., etc. The other thing that was important coming out of the open-ended working group was that it was agreed that the co-chairs and the executive secretary, in other words, the CBD, the secretariat, will prepare a zero draft text of the new global biodiversity framework, and that this would be ready before the second meeting of the open-ended working group, where they will obviously discuss more content and substantive issues. In terms of the future work plan, it was also agreed that a more detailed work plan would be presented at the informal briefs that the co-chairs will do at the SABSTA meeting, the subsidiary body on scientific, technical and technological advice. And then it was also, one of the other outcomes was that at the next SABSTA meeting, one of the things that's obviously taking a lot of attention and interest is the issue of targets. There's a lot of talk about apex goal targets, and smart targets, indicators, etc. And it was agreed that at the November SABSTA meeting that there would be guidance coming from SABSTA on specifically on goals, on targets, what are smart targets, what are appropriate targets, what are the indicators that we need to be looking at, baselines, looking at the monitoring frameworks, all of this obviously in relation to the loss of biodiversity and being important means to measure and to achieve transformational change within the scope of the convention, the three objectives of the convention. So as far as the possible elements of the global biodiversity framework is concerned, this took up a lot of the discussion, and most of the parties made numerous inputs on this, and the sort of agreement was that the main elements would be, there would be a rationale and scope. Then we would focus on the sort of 2050 vision. There would be a section dealing on the 2030 mission, the discussion also around apex goal, milestones, etc. A lot of it a very important element would be looking at goals, targets, sub-targets and indicators, and there was a lot of discussion around how these targets should be structured, what type of targets, what they should, what sort of areas they should cover, etc. There was also an important discussion on the cross-cutting issues and approaches and what these are and what should be covered under them. There was a lot of convergence around this, but also a lot of divergence. Some of the issues that they identified under this particular heading or aspect would be things, for example, like mainstreaming in relation to the various production sectors like agriculture, forestry, fisheries, aquaculture, tourism, energy, mining, infrastructure, manufacturing, processing, etc. Gender was an issue that was raised, indigenous people and local communities, the importance of partnerships, intergenerational equity and rights-based approaches, and connectivity. So as you can see, a very wide range of topics being discussed under so-called cross-cutting issues and approaches. And then also a lot of discussion around implementation, what would be the sort of means for implementation. An important thing there was that NVSAPs are seen as the main mechanism for implementation, and the other things that they talked about was the sort of monitoring mechanisms, reporting, the question of voluntary commitments, compliance monitoring, the importance of transparency, etc. Just one important point to make here is that there is opportunity to make submissions on the structure of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and the deadline for this is the 15th of September 2019, and the documents are available on the CBC website. As far as possible implications for local and subnational governments are concerned, just two important things to say: that ICLEI, together with representatives from the province of Quebec, who were representing the advisory committee on subnational governments, presented a 6-minute opening statement on the first day. And then the other point, in which we really emphasized the importance of local governments and subnational governments, and the fact that they have a real contribution to make in terms of not just the negotiations going forward, but also once the new Global Biodiversity Framework is in place, obviously in the implementation, in monitoring, reporting, etc. And then there was also on, I think it was the 29th, the discussion under the Future Work Programme. There was a statement also delivered by ICLEI on behalf, this time, of the local and subnational government constituency in relation to the Future Work Programme and what we were sort of, we were expecting and committing in terms of that. So as a result, I think of not just these interventions, and both of those submissions were presented by Kubi Brandt, our regional director, and the director of the CBC, but obviously also just the fact that local governments have increasingly played a role in contributing to achieving the objectives of the convention. We found that there were no less than 17 parties that referred to local and subnational governments in some or other way in their submissions. And this was primarily in the discussion on the elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And there was general agreement on the importance of the important role that all levels of subnational government will be playing in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And for example, in the conclusions to the meeting, the co-chairs reaffirmed the need for the continued and active engagement of subnational governments, and they specifically mentioned subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities, and the fact that they also reaffirmed their contribution to the process of developing the post-2020 framework. Something else that came out, which is important too, is the point that was made on more than one occasion, that the 3 objectives of the convention needed to be treated equally, and these deal with the objective around the conservation of biological diversity, its sustainable use of its components, and the question of fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising from genetic resources. Something else, as I said earlier, that was important was the NBSAPs are here to stay, and they're seen as the main implementation instrument. And very important in relation to NBSAPs was the question of vertical integration to ensure implementation and achievement of targets, both global and national. And something else that came out was the need to ensure that there was better and stronger alignment between NBSAPs and what is reported in the national reports. And then various of the cross-cutting approaches and issues are important to local and subnational governments, and many of those submissions that I mentioned earlier, where parties were referring to local and subnational governments, was in connection with this, and they highlighted things such as connectivity and the role that local and subnational governments play, not just there, but also in partnerships, in mainstreaming, etc. So some of the other views that were expressed relating specifically to local and subnational governments was that there must be a prioritization of equal distribution of biodiversity, specifically conservation costs and benefits across all levels of government, from local to global, and that it should not just focus on national or global. I've already talked about the issues around the emphasis that was placed on the role that local and subnational governments can play in mainstreaming, partnerships, connectivity. But the point was also made that these aspects, or these cross-cutting issues and approaches, are of equal importance. They're not of less importance to some of the other aspects, and they should also be reflected in appropriate goals, targets, and indicators. Again, more than once the point was made that it's important to engage all levels of subnational governments. And then very importantly, there was a lot of views around reviewing the decision of COP10, decision 1022, on the plan of action on subnational governments, cities, and other local authorities, and to develop a more ambitious plan which would enable parties to support efforts and recognize the contribution of cities, local and subnational authorities. And this actually is one of the points that Quibi made in her presentation in the opening address. And there was also support expressed actually for ICLEI's 10-point framework, the draft that Quibi floated at the Open-Ended Working Group, and which she will present on a little later this morning, so I'm not going to dwell on that more. Then, as I said, there was a very ambitious future work program, and this is just a list of some of the major meetings. It's impossible to actually reflect them all. It's literally pages long, and it's a very complicated work program. I've referred to some of them, as I said, the SABSTers, but there's also some local and subnational meetings, such as the one that's being organized in Brazil in early February next year. There's another one that the Scottish government is organizing, also for subnational governments, which will be held in April of next year. There's the IUCN World Congress that will have a special focus on cities. And there are numerous meetings. Some of the thematic workshops include issues around also resource mobilization and capacity building, which besides things like ecosystem restoration are obviously also of importance for cities and subnational governments. And at this point, what I want to do is just briefly just give you some information and some updates on the work of the Informal Advisory Group on mainstreaming. As we have reported previously, ICLEI represents the local and subnational constituency on this advisory group on mainstreaming. So it was interesting to note that there were various views expressed at the Open-Ended Working Group on mainstreaming, and again these reaffirmed the significance and the importance of all levels of subnational government, where they were saying that mainstreaming is something that needs to happen across government and across all sectors, and that they viewed cities, local authorities and subnational governments as having a very broad support in order to implement mainstreaming. The views of the IAG, the advisory group, is that mainstreaming, obviously being mooted as a cross-cutting issue, is also the pathway to transformative change. And something else is the importance of harmonizing biodiversity and development strategies between all levels of government on the one hand, and the importance of decentralized cooperation for mainstreaming on the other hand. And again, this is something where local and metropolitan and subnational governments will come in. At the moment, the focus of the advisory group is on preparing the long-term approach to mainstreaming, or the LTAM as it's known. And essentially the objective or the goal is to identify priorities for action, to look at the sort of, what's the scientific evidence of impacts and benefits, who's going to be the key actors, unpacking some of the previous COP decisions. There was a Cancun declaration on mainstreaming in 2016, and then there was a very big decision last year at the Sharm el-Sheikh COP also on mainstreaming, and then the question of how do you assess and monitor progress around mainstreaming. So the current focus is on developing a skeleton for the long-term approach to mainstreaming. Some of the issues that we are looking at is, for example, issues of risk management, and this is something that speaks directly to cities. The question of how do you value nature's benefits, the importance of nature-based solutions, very specifically looking at nature in cities through, for example, things like green and blue infrastructure, land use and spatial planning. There's a lot of work being done around that. The other thing that's coming up is that it's no longer good enough to just make small concessions or just talk about business as usual. We need a whole new and very transformative approach. Also talking about concerted and collective integration of biodiversity targets that look specifically at how, through mainstreaming, strategies can support the bending the curve in terms of biodiversity loss. And then another thing that I think is important for subnational governments is the fact that we need effective regulatory instruments, incentives, awareness, education, and these are all things that can also happen at subnational levels. And then, as I said earlier, the question of NBSAPs as being an important mainstreaming tool. And within the discussion on NBSAPs, the issue is around vertical integration. There are several challenges. Obviously there are some obstacles that would hinder mainstreaming at the different levels, and we need to identify what those are and what the solutions are. We need to look at gaps. We obviously need to prioritize where are the biggest wins going to be, what are the most important things to do, what is the additional areas of work that need to be identified and researched, how do you develop smart targets to measure mainstreaming progress. And then something else is that there's some really interesting stuff that has come out of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the IPBES, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that are relevant to mainstreaming, and specifically what happens at the local government level. For example, the IPBES, there's a chapter 6 which talks about options for decision makers, and they have a whole section on integrated approaches for sustainable cities, which I think is very important and is clearly something that the IAG is wanting to take up in the long-term approach to mainstreaming. And just very quickly, the path ahead, as you can see, it's very ambitious. At the moment, we're sort of on the left-hand side, we're in September of where we've just had the open-ended working group. We're going to be working on the LTAM now, and the big sort of deadline is by July, August next year at the open-ended working group number 3 to come up with a report and concrete proposals for the long-term approach to mainstreaming that can be taken up in the new global biodiversity framework. And with that, I am going to end my presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Ingrid. It's very exciting to see how much is on the go and how much is planned for the months coming up, as well as to take stock of what has happened so far. So thank you for sharing, Ingrid. I'm mindful of time, and with that in mind, I want to hand over almost instantly to Kobie Brandt. And she's going to be talking a little bit about the process of shaping the post-2020 global biodiversity framework from the local and subnational level, with specific reference to ICLEI's 10-point framework for subnational biodiversity action. And we're very excited to be sharing this work with you. So with that, I will hand over to you, Kobie.
Thank you very much, Tim, and it's nice to be part of this webinar. Thank you to everybody who is joining this process. We will be having another webinar later today to accommodate other people in other time zones, but thank you to those who are here with us now. So in terms of the development of a subnational and local government position, we can ask why. Why are we doing it? Well, we've never engaged this intensely ahead of a COP within our constituency, and this is a very special COP, and this is why we are undertaking the effort from ICLEI's side, and we are really appealing to all other networks of local and subnational governments and our partners and cities and regions around the world to join us in developing this a very strong position. It is also true that at the local and subnational level of government, the issues around biodiversity are different. They're very diverse as well, because we live in a very diverse world with different legal competencies at these levels of government, different legal mandates, etc. But what we have in common is that we are at the level of government closest to the communities, to the people, where whatever deal is going to be made in Kunming in China at the end of next year is going to have to be implemented ultimately within our regions and within our towns and our cities. So we need to ensure that our voices are heard now, loud and clearly, so that we are going to be able to implement what comes out of China. And in order to make sure that our voices are heard, it's stronger to act collectively. It's also advisable, and may I advise and also encourage all of the local and subnational governments tuned in here to work very closely with your parties, with your national governments, because it's the national governments that will ultimately agree on the deal, and we are making inputs. We are influencing that deal as a collective body of local and subnationals, but ultimately you as a local and or subnational government, you have the eyes and ears of your national government right there in the country where you're based, and you can already influence their thinking so that the deal is a strong and good one for our local and urban communities. That's partly why we are embarking on this webinar series, is to really mobilize and get people on board and get people thinking about what it is that we as local and subnational governments want to present to the parties for them to consider when they craft the new deal or the new global biodiversity framework, as it is referred to. And one thing is clear, that is that definitely the NBSAPs are definitely there to stay. We got this clearly from the Open-Ended Working Group and from our discussions with the parties. So we already have a tool, quite a good tool, that demonstrates how local and subnational actions can be valued and taken up and reported on and enrich thereby the NBSAPs of the future. So that's good news, I think, for our constituency. Another piece of really good news is that when Ingrid and I and our friend from Quebec and Regions 4 were sitting in the discussions at the Open-Ended Working Group in Nairobi last week, we were really pleasantly surprised to see how many, no less than 17 governments, parties to the convention actually stood up and spoke out about subnational and local governments in one way or another, talking about the importance of including us in their considerations when making a new agreement, when crafting the new agreement, and as very, very strong and important partners, of course, for implementation. So with that background, I think, you know, we definitely need to come together with a strong statement, and ICLEI has taken the liberty, like many other organizations also, to come up with our first take on such a position, which I'm going to go through very briefly with you now in the few minutes we've got left. But I'm going to invite you to look at this statement. We will circulate it within the next 2 weeks to everybody that's been on this webinar or anybody else that's interested. It will be an open statement. It will also be available on our roadmap website. Yeah. So at this point, please bear in mind that this is ICLEI's input, and it's very much a draft, and it's very much calling for inputs and enrichment from anybody within ICLEI, but also anybody from other networks of local and subnational governments, as well as any other stakeholder in our broader constituency. So we want to craft a very inclusive statement, which we want to take to the next open-ended working group as something not just from ICLEI, but something from our broader community of cities and regions. So please do feel free to make your comments, and please do not feel that our 10 points need to be the 10 points that we take forward, and feel free to really make your points heard and felt. We will definitely take them all into consideration when crafting the next statement. And by the way, we have a subnational and local government area where we are seated in these open-ended working groups. So anybody who wants to join us in Kunming in February next year at the open-ended working group number 2, you are most welcome. Just please notify us beforehand so that we can help with your registration as part of our constituency. So with that, yeah, I've spoken about the 10 points. Here's just a little bit of background for those who are not aware of who ICLEI is. But this is really already quite a powerful group of local and subnational governments that are coming in behind this statement, no less than 1,750. And some of them are local government networks, like national networks in countries, representing many, many more local and subnational governments. So it's already a sizable group. And I just want to note here that many of you will know that UCLG's World Congress is coming up. It's going to take place in Durban in South Africa, I think next month. It's November or sorry, I don't have the exact dates on me, but it's in the next month or two. And we will be presenting this draft statement there as well at a high level intervention, and UCLG will hopefully then also make their formal inputs as a network, working closely with us, so that by the open-ended working group in China, we'll definitely have the UCLG community coming on board the statement as well. We know that NRG or Regions 4, as they are now called, are also very much behind a consolidated statement. We will be hoping to get the same sort of commitments and inputs from the Committee of Regions in Europe, the Goals Group, who we work with so closely, and many other networks and individual cities and regions. So we decided to frame our statement around 10 digestible essential aspects, and essentially we call for inclusion of all these 10 points into the new post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. We presented the outline of this last week in Nairobi, and it was very well received. And now we are further developing it with inputs from people like yourselves and organizations like yourselves. So if we look at the first points, I'm going to go through it very quickly, but this presentation will also be available to you afterwards. The first point is around multi-level governance. We are calling for multi-level governance. We know that it's very active and quite common already in the climate world over the last 2-3 years. It really just rose to the top of the attention of national governments and subnational governments, that this multi-level governance up and downstream of independent spheres of government actually is very important. These levels of government need to take hands if we're going to see the transformative change that the world needs now. And that will also allow, specifically in the context of biodiversity, landscape level approaches which cut across the different boundaries and jurisdictions of the different levels of government. The second point is around inclusive and action-orientated engagement mechanisms. We understand that there really needs to be engagement mechanisms for a whole of society approach, and that the nature trajectory and rate of extinction is caused by humanity. We know that now, and therefore it needs to be top of the global agenda, very much standing alongside, not under and not as a vehicle for addressing the climate crisis only, but very much standing right next to the climate crisis. We're hearing more and more talk about the double crisis that the world is facing on the nature and on the climate front, and therefore proper engagement mechanisms that are cross-cutting are so important. The third point is focused around increased national and local investment for biodiversity and nature-based solutions. We know that the funding is not flowing in the volumes that it should towards nature-based solutions and towards addressing biodiversity at all levels. But we also should making an appeal here to countries to look inside at their own fiscals and their own powerful internal budgets in terms of restructuring, reprioritizing, rethinking these budgets, how they are drawn up, what portions go to subnational and local governments for implementation, and then also at these local levels of government, how they draw up their budgets. Like a big city, they've got a huge amount of budget available to them in many cases, most parts of the world, but is it drawn up with nature as a mainstreamed agenda, as a top priority agenda? Yes, in some instances it's already happening in the climate space, but not really so much in the nature space. And we believe that there's a lot of funding sitting inside countries that could be spent, for instance, for infrastructure development. If choices are made around procurement practices, etc., to rather favor green and blue infrastructure solutions over the traditional old school infrastructure options, that is working with nature, that is planning with nature, and that's investing in nature. So a lot can be done internally. The second financial point, number 4, is around external investment. And here we are really making the argument that some of these big funds out there are not yet catered or very accessible for local and subnational governments to access directly. It's quite cumbersome, these processes, these application processes, and not many local governments really understand or have the capacity to come up with bankable projects or understand the processes they'll have to go through to go all the way towards investable and bankable projects. So here we're calling for easy, accessible, and simple instruments that can be accessible to local and subnational governments, of course, through and with the support of their national governments, and with the intention of contributing very much directly to the national government goals. So it's not a separate standalone fund we're talking about, but something that will absolutely always speak to the NBSAPs and support national ambitions and targets, or maybe exceed national ambitions and targets, as we see in many parts of the world. That sometimes also is the case, where sometimes cities lead where nations can't at certain points in time and history. And that's also required and encouraged if needed. The fifth point is about the realization of the multiple social benefits of mainstreaming nature into cities. There's a lot of evidence coming out around the multiple health benefits and well-being benefits of our communities, which more than half of our population already live in urban spaces, and the trajectory we all know is really pointing towards an urban century, and we already in a sense are living the urban century. So we need to make sure that the quality of life for people in cities is one that connects them with nature. The reconnection with nature for our younger generations and for our existing generations and future generations is absolutely vital. We know now for mental, physical, social, and spiritual well-being, connecting their culture and their society very much with nature is very much part and parcel of us. After all, we are a species, just like any other species in nature. And then, so that whole argument about the social health and well-being that can only be achieved through a society deeply connected with nature and deeply valuing nature and deeply engaging with nature on a daily basis, touching, feeling, seeing, smelling, and engaging, understanding where food comes from, all those things. That is captured in that point. The next point is around the interconnectedness with other global agendas. I've spoken a little bit about this, but it is absolutely vital that the nature agenda is not seen as something apart from the SDGs or a new urban deal or a new urban agenda rather, or the climate agenda, or any of the other cumulative challenges that we're facing as the world moves forward and as we are developing as a species on Earth. It's vital that we do make these connections, and we're calling for very direct and strong connections. This came out, I think, universally from all parties that spoke last week in Nairobi. Everybody wants to see stronger links with the other Rio conventions, but also with all the other global agendas. Point number 7 is around knowledge, research and science. We know that we do not have enough data. We do not have enough evidence-based arguments in all instances about the importance of nature and the role that nature plays in pulling our society, in servicing our society in terms of ecosystem services and goods on the one hand, but also on the other hand, what it actually, what the sum total of these benefits are for us to live with nature. We know we can't live without nature. Nature can probably live without us, but or definitely, but it's not necessarily the case the other way around. So, but we need more science-based information for these arguments and for designing bankable projects, investable projects that are attractive to both the public and the private sector to come on board and make sure that these projects ultimately get implemented. Downscale data, specifically at the local level, is still very much, you know, it's not at the level we want it to be, and it's very much talking to different sets of data, and the collection methods and so on are not aligned. So a lot of work needs to be done there, specifically at our levels, and we're calling on parties to realize that and to enable us to do that. And then the 8th point is around a call to come behind the needed lifestyle and consumption pattern changes required, and the decoupling, the full decoupling of consumption patterns and natural resource use from the quality of life and local economies. It's happening, but it's not happening at the scale and all over the world that we really that's really required, because we are really talking about transformative change that is required at this stage. And then a part of that argument is also around the promotion of non-extractive economic activities. The last, the number 9, second last point, is around calling just for a dedicated, strong decision on local and subnational governments. We all know the plan of action as captured in decision 1022 was the first comprehensive plan of action or decision that was focused on local governments and subnational governments, and that's coming to an end. That plan of action runs till 2020, so we're calling for a second, more ambitious plan of action or decision. What it will be called is still unknown, but that is basically the essence of point number 9. And point number 10, which is unfortunately numbered 9 here on the screen, is actually point number 10, and that's calling for the establishment of and support for a commitment and reporting mechanism for local and subnational governments. And there we want to make the point that we already have cities with nature as such an CBD endorsed platform where cities and other levels of subnational government can make their commitments, they can share their ambitions, and they can share their tools and projects and progresses and engagements that's happening at the local and subnational level. And we want to see many more local and subnational governments actually joining this platform, and we're also calling for this platform to be formalized and taken up, and even if need be reshaped so that it speaks to the needs of the parties as well. What we don't want is to have a duplicative reporting structure that on the one hand cities and subnational governments have to report through their NBSAP processes and through the Cities with Nature platform. So we are looking at Cities with Nature specifically built in a way that the reports and the information gathered in the Cities with Nature platform can very easily, almost seamlessly, feed into any national NBSAP in the future. So we're very excited about working with our partners there, IUCN, TNC, and the many others, as well as with the CBD Secretariat in this instance. So those are essentially the 10 points that are on the table. Please add to that. Please speak to Tim, who's organizing these webinars. There is an email at the end, and Tim's going to close off for us, but we really are looking forward to your inputs now, so that it's not only an ICLEI position we take forward, but a whole of society or a whole of constituency position that we take forward to the next Openended working group. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kobe. There you have it. There is the 10-point plan in draft on the table, and as Kobe's mentioned, we welcome any and all inputs at this point. So please do not hesitate to get in contact with any of us and continue to engage with this important process so that we can have it as inclusive as possible as we develop it further and take it to the next few engagements. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for being with us in this 5th webinar. Now that both presentations are over, I'm going to just open the floor if there are any questions or points for discussion. And as I mentioned before, there's 2 ways you can do this, either by raising your hand or posting a question or comment in the box on the panel on your right. So I'm just going to give a few seconds to the floor in case there is anyone who has a question or point to raise. Okay, it doesn't look like there are any questions at this point. As Kobe mentioned before, we will be running the webinar again today at 3 p.m. South African Standard Time, which is GMT +2. And yes, that we will circulate within the next few weeks the 10-point plan, as well as a few of the other resources that Ingrid mentioned, the statements that were made at the Openended Working Group, for example. We will circulate those with the webinar recording in the next week or so. So thank you so much for joining us. As always, we are so grateful for your continued engagement and participation in this process, and we look forward to welcoming those who will be on this afternoon's webinar, otherwise welcoming you to the 6th webinar, which will happen in a month's time. and the links to register for that are available on the local and subnational government engagement platform. The link will be sent to you in the follow-up email from this webinar as well. So thank you everyone, and have a great day or evening further.